Hello, my name is Joe Carr. This is a presentation I gave to young mining professionals and Min South on deep sea mining, so I hope you enjoy it. Some of you may have heard me speak in the past, but some of you may not have. So my name is, as I said, Joe Carr, and I'm the Innovation Director at Exora. I was asked to speak on this topic by Bianca from the YMP because we're aware that a lot of people are knowledgeable or they know about deep sea mining, but they don't actually know a lot about the process or what it involves or anything that's happened. It's very much a peripheral topic within the mining sector and to a lot of other people as well. So this is not a topic people follow, and so we decided to put this together really to provide some context about deep sea mining. Now, originally, I had wanted to talk about the technicalities of deep sea mining and what it entailed and the various types of mining methods and the various deposit types and those kind of things. As you can see, there's three different types, nodules, hydrothermal vents, and crusts, and we'll be focused on nodules. But actually, that presentation was something that, although interesting to a certain audience, I don't think it was a requirement that people needed to know. A lot of this information is out there. You can look it up. You can find out about this kind of, deep sea mining and the various types. I was going to talk about seabed crusts and the thicknesses and where you could find them and what's the difference between a seabed crust and a volcanic sulfide hot smoker deposit. I was going to talk about nodules and where you can find them and the harvesting type. And the fact that at the moment this is the most viable form of deep sea mining, and we'll come on to the specifics of that later on. The location, this is the Clarion-Clipperton zone, or the CCZ, as I'll call it, sort of from this point onwards, which is a location where the world's focus is at the moment on deep sea nodules and really where the race is on. And we're going to talk about, how it actually works, the specifics of the technology, as well as the positives and negatives, the controversy surrounding the industry, what we might expect to happen next with the International Seabed Authority. And I'm sure as an audience, you would have found all of this information very interesting, no doubt. But I personally think there's a much more interesting way to look at deep sea mining, and that is really to parallel deep sea mining with something else and compare it to an industry where I think actually you can look at it and say that's a path that the mining industry with deep sea mining may follow. And so it's a question I ask to you, the listener, the watcher, is in your mind, what do you think the parallels of the deep sea mining industry are? What industry do you think that compares with? And the reason I ask is that the other day it was a discussion topic when I was going to be sitting on a panel, and somebody said to me, "Are there any other industries that the mining industry seems to be following the path of?" And in my view, there are. And I think we're, decades, maybe 20 years behind. So, I won't keep you waiting, but I will give you a clue. You know, what is this rig in front of us? And to answer the question I set, it's a shale gas rig. And the reason I'm showing this is, apart from my admiration for shale gas drillers and what they can do with their drilling technology and where they can go, is that I believe deep sea mining has very strong parallels with the shale gas industry. I think deep sea mining is to mining people as shale gas is to the classic oil driller. It represents something very new, very different, and very controversial. And it's something that I believe in deep sea mining may just completely change the industry as we know it, the mining industry. And that's the topic that I want to talk about today. So we're going to get into that and we're going to discuss and think about, is deep sea mining, is this a new way of thinking about the current debate that we have? So the question is deep sea mining the new shale gas? There are pretty big parallels between the two industries. If we compare the timeline for shale gas, It took decades of development. It was known about 200 years ago, and it was a great curiosity, but people couldn't really do a lot with it. And it was only after sort of well over a century that people started thinking, maybe we can do something, right? It's the 1940s. There was the first use of hydraulic fracturing, and shale gas was uneconomic for the first 200 years of its life. And it only took a number of technologies coming together: seismic mapping, drilling, materials technology for drill bits, pumping, fluid mechanics, chemistry, the ability to hold open the rock once it had been broken, to allow the gas to come out. And there was no single technology there that enabled fracking to take place. You couldn't have just said, oh, directional drilling, that wasn't going to make it happen. It was only when they all came together in roughly the late 90s, early 2000s, that finally the ability to economically extract shale gas was possible. And in my view, seabed mining is 10 to 20 years behind that timeline. And if you look at the timeline for seabed mining, we see a striking resemblance. The first minerals were discovered in sort of the 1870s, on a British expedition. And again, brilliant curiosity at the time. People were amazed by it, but there wasn't really much you could do economically. And in the 1970s, there were a number of trials. People got very excited about it. And there was a number of trials by companies we know today: BP Minerals and Kennecott. That's today Rio Tinto. There was a number of trials, but again, the technology just wasn't there. They got close, but yeah, it wasn't good enough. And even in the 2000s, there were a number of seabed mining companies that got very, very close. People like Nautilus, but they just couldn't make it work. But today we have the first successful trials for deep sea nodule collection. This company called the Metals Company is a good example. They collected several thousand tons of nodules from the seafloor. And we may have just reached the point of economic sustainability where the technology has finally caught up with the plan, the want, the need. So what does this all really mean? Well, it's sort of the genie in the bottle point, right? Regardless of your personal view, whether you're for or against seabed mining or ambiguous, or you don't know what your view is, we have finally reached a point where the economics are in place to make it work. And so, what does that mean, right? What does it even mean if we have seabed mining? So this is a good example, bringing it back to the comparison between shale gas and deep sea mining. So this is the exports of American crude oil and American natural gas. And this is the point at which fracking became economically viable, not at scale, but it was possible. And you can see the timeline lag between possibility and actuality and realization. And the impact of shale drilling has been colossal on the US economy. For the first time in history, the world's largest economy has essentially been able to decouple itself from the global energy market, um, really reducing the risk to America and reducing the power of people like OPEC. And for the first time in its history, making America an exporter of energy. And that's meant that America and its allies have suddenly become far less dependent on Middle Eastern and Russian oil and gas. You've seen that with the exports of LNG into Europe as a reaction of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's also shielded America from the impacts of that war, which has consumed a lot of other countries in Europe and other places that have been hit by those energy shocks. America has not. So America is suddenly self-sufficient, and it's been able to chart a foreign policy without having to worry about the impacts that that foreign policy could potentially have on its energy security. But does deep sea mining really offer the same thing as shale gas? So first, the seabed, it doesn't belong to anyone. Yes, obviously there's areas of the seabed that sit within countries' economic exclusive zones, or EEZs, but the vast majority of the seabed obviously does not. And interestingly enough, the CCZ, or the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, as we spoke about, certainly does not. but it does sit between the world's two biggest political and economic rivals, geopolitical rivals in the Pacific, China and the USA. It's some 4.5 million square kilometers of a flat space between Hawaii and Mexico, that contains millions upon millions of nodules, potentially billions. And in the 2021, the USGS estimated that the CCZ contains 3 times the amount of nickel in the combined land reserves for mines on land. It contains 6 times the amount of cobalt than in land reserve. And as a comparison, the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, which produces 80% of the world's cobalt, has a reserve of 3.6 million tons. The CCZ holds 12 times more cobalt than the DRC. So there's a massive amount of cobalt in that space. And it also contains sort of 4 times the world's current reserve of manganese. And there's other things in there as well. There's nickel and many other interesting critical minerals like copper. So, it's a very interesting place to look at. And when you look at the geographic location and what it could mean, it's very interesting. Now, when we look at the CCZ, you've got to really appreciate what that means in terms of its location, right? This isn't an easy place to access. It's roughly between 4 and 5,000 meters. The trial collection area was 4,300 meters. And to put that in context, the deepest missile submarines go to 730 meters, the giant squid at 1,100. The deepest depth we've ever known a whale to go is 3,000 meters. The Titanic sits at 4,000, and the world's deepest mine is also 4,000 meters. So just simply mining in this location, it would be the world's deepest mine. For people who need some other context, you can have sort of 5.5 barges, many Eiffel Towers, or hundreds and hundreds of London buses, thousands of chihuahuas, whatever unit of measurement you want. It's a very, very deep place. It's very, very dark. It's very, very quiet. It's a flat, featureless stretch of nothingness for thousands and thousands of square kilometers. And these planes are the source of the imagery that we all know when people talk about deep sea mining, showing the millions and millions of little sort of potato-sized, golf ball-sized lumps on the seabed. And this area is known as the abyssal plain. Sits just below the midnight zone. Whoever names these places, they've got a very good imagination. And this is the manganese nodules. This is what it looks like. This is roughly 4,500 meters of depth. And the current method to harvest nodules is not complicated. When people say seabed mining, the mine jumps to trucks and shovels and drills and explosives, and tearing up of the seafloor. And that's really not at all what seabed mining is. It's more akin to really suctioning up. These things sit just on the seabed. They're literally there. If you could hold your breath and swim down, you could pick them up by hand. And the current method to harvest these nodules simply involves loosening them from the seabed with a little water jet and sucking them up. Obviously, there's more to it than that specifically, but essentially it's a giant seabed nodule sucker-upper machine. Here's an artist's impression. And the processing remains basically the same as a traditional mine, except that you don't have to worry about the concentration stage, which would traditionally be the crush and grind, the stage where you go from, in a traditional copper mine, 0.5% copper, to take that 0.5% copper out of the rock. That doesn't exist in seabed mining, so you don't really have the issue of tailings, which we will talk about. But for want of a better way of doing it, you can essentially throw these things straight into a smelter, and you will get your metal out. Bringing it back to shale gas and the comparison between the two, shale gas revolutionized the ability of America to export energy for the first time. And this is still a question of energy. This is still a race for energy. It's just we're in the new energy sector and batteries. And just between two global superpowers sits the world's largest reserve of strategic minerals. And it's basically there for the taking, doesn't belong to anyone. The ability to not have to depend on an external supplier, an external country, a supply chain for critical minerals is an incredible advantage. And China isn't asleep at the wheel on this either. It was only last month that the Chinese People Congress, or one of the delegates specifically mentioned that China realizes it's behind in seabed mining technology and is looking to accelerate its program. That's not to say that nobody has power over the seabed. There is an organization which does, and that's the snappily and originally named International Seabed Authority, or the ISA. The ISA is an organization which was founded in the 1980s to do what it says on the tin. It's essentially an authority which is supposed to have a control and regulation of the international seabed. It's based in Jamaica, so it's got to be one of the best UN bodies to work for, hands down. And for a long time, the ISA really didn't do anything on seabed mining because it had other priorities for the seabed, like fishing. It was only in 2021 that Nauru, a small Pacific Island nation, invoked an article within the ISA's charter that meant it basically had 2 years to put up or shut up on regulations. That after that point, mining could commence based on whatever regulations are in place at the time. Now, that clock expires in July of this year. And after that point, mining can commence. Now, the International Seabed Authority matters here because it can set the regulations for who can do what and where they can do it. But I guess the biggest question is, can it? And what if I was to ask you, the viewer, which countries were members of the ISA and which countries were not? Now, you may think that maybe the ocean-going superpower of Mongolia was not a member, or perhaps Paraguay. Well, they're both members of the International Seabed Authority, but there is a Pacific Ocean facing global superpower who's very much absent from the ISA, and does not need to follow its rulings and does not let other countries stand in its way and likes to make sure it can do things however it likes. And if that country you were to guess was the USA, then you would be exactly right. America is not a member of the ISA, does not abide by its rulings. And frankly, who would be telling America what to do in the Pacific anyway? It's its own backyard. So to conclude the section and sort of bring it back to shale gas and the potential impacts of the CCZ and deep sea mining, we have a massive resource of material, in demand resource, positioned between two of the most powerful and least likely to listen to anybody else countries in the world. A resource which could turn anybody, any country, any company who controls it into a nation who's unbeholden to anybody else really on those critical minerals and has the ability to dominate that market and set the price. And a resource which has finally become economic to extract, where we've reached the point where bringing a ton of material up costs less than that material is worth. And that all sounds great, right? Fantastic. So why aren't we doing more of this? Well, we come on to the biggest challenge with seabed mining, and was the shale gas as well, that they both have extremely negative views on the environmental grounds of actually going ahead and doing that. And that's really where we find the third parallel between shale gas and seabed mining. And this is an image that people will remember. This is it's an image from Greenpeace, and what it shows is a person lighting their tap water on fire in a place where fracking was taking place. And for a long time in America, 10, 15 years ago, there was a massive debate for and against fracking. And in the end, the shale drillers won. Fracking continues to this day in America, and it's hugely successful for them, as we've seen and spoke about. Now, this image actually is nothing to do with fracking, but that doesn't really matter. The fact is, people remember this, and regardless of the cause, people see this and they remember people lighting tap water on fire. And there was a big debate in the UK about 10 years ago on shale gas. Should we do it? Should we not do it? And there was clear opposition. People said it would cause earthquakes. It could release chemicals into the groundwater. It could cause our taps to burn. And for whatever reason, people decided that they didn't want fracking in the UK. They had the discussion. They decided they didn't want it. Shale gas production in the US is far less contentious now than it was. The bulk of American gas is produced from unconventional means, basically shale gas. And the environmental concerns continue to exist. And outside of America, fracking, shale gas extraction, title, or whatever you want to call it, remains incredibly decisive. And as you can imagine, deep sea mining is no less controversial with the audience that looks at it, and there are many arguments for and against it, and they are far more complex than shale gas, and we'll get into that. And on one side, to basically pin the points down, on one side there is the argument that we know very little about the deep ocean and its ecology. We should leave it well alone. And the other side of the argument is we need these minerals. So the argument that's put forward by those who don't want deep sea mining has merit. It definitely has merit. People can look at it and you cannot argue with the logic that what we know about the deep sea ocean, what little we know, shows that life there is incredibly slow. Any damage that we do may take decades, possibly centuries to repair. We have no idea. And then there's a lot of questions about the practicalities, that we're going to put big machines into the ocean where it's quiet and dark, and there will be an impact. Would lights cause an issue to wildlife? Would disturb sediment on the seafloor smother what's down there? Even if there is a very small amount of flora or fauna, these are all incredibly valid points against seabed mining. Now, on the other side of things, we have a need for metal. They have to come from somewhere. We have to have these new metals for a range of reasons. The most pointed is that if we want to transition to green energy and away from fossil fuels, including shale gas, ironically, we're going to need more metals than we've ever had before. This is a demand forecast from Bloomberg. And you can see, nickel, that's a deep sea mining nodule resource. You've got copper, you've got cobalt, you've got manganese. All of those can come from nodules. So we're going to need the metals for the green energy transition. We're also going to need the metals because we have a burgeoning middle class around the world. There's going to be more people than ever who require things like air conditioning, require things like fridges, require all the things that we take for granted in the West. And the idea that we could turn around to someone in India and say, oh, you can't have that because, sorry, we can't mine any more metal for you guys, so you're just going to have to live the way you're living, it's not acceptable to those people. So we're going to have to come up with some way to get it. And although recycling is excellent for doing a lot of that, most of our demand is net new. We need wind turbines, we need solar panels. They don't exist today to recycle. So we have to put the material in to be able to recycle it later. Another key point is the tailings dam issue. This is the amount of tailings we've been producing globally. And to put it in context, in the 1920s, the average grade in a copper mine was something like 2%. The average grade in a mine today, a copper mine, is something like 0.5. So we need to mine 4 times the amount of rock to have the same production as we had in the 1920s. And there's obviously a lot more demand today. So we've seen an exponential growth in the amount of material we're putting to tailings, because when you mine 1 ton of rock, at 0.5% copper, you're essentially putting 1 ton of rock into tailings. It's basically a 1-for-1 relationship. And so we've seen a number of serious failures over the last few decades, and we've seen a growing number of very serious failures. And we can potentially expect that trend to continue as we mine more and more material. We have to put it somewhere. Whereas deep sea mining and nodules, there is no tailings because the material is essentially fully graded. You can put it almost straight into a smelter. And on the environmental damage, there is a question to be had and a debate to be had. Is the deep sea the least worst place to build a mine? We know there is limited, if even if it is unknown, we know there's very limited biodiversity. And for an example, on land, research has shown that you might expect a biomass of something like 15 to 30 kilos per square meter. It depends where you are. On the abyssal plains, it's 13 grams. So there's significantly less biodiversity. Where would you prefer? Would you like an open pit in the jungle of the Amazon, or would you prefer nodule harvesting on the seabed? There's no trucks, there's no shovels, there's no explosives, there's no processing plants consuming energy to grind rocks. There's no risk of child labor or artisanal miners. Um, there's a argument to be had that seabed mining might be the most environmentally friendly way to mine. And finally, people will argue that, well, you're going to build a land-based mine anyway, because there's so much demand. But that argument is it's an economic fallacy. Low cost production will always displace high cost production. People don't spend billions of dollars building mines for the fun of it. If there is a cheaper source, then people who cost more to produce, they will produce more material, the metals price will fall, and the uneconomic producers will mothball the mines and they will be shut down. So it just doesn't make economic sense to have the argument that, oh, you're going to build a mine on land anyway. So that really closes the loop to shale gas. Those are all the various questions. Is deep sea mining the next shale gas? That's a question for you, the audience. I can't answer that. But shale gas has proven that even at a higher cost of production than conventional gas, which shale gas is more expensive, when it comes online, when the prices make sense, it can have a significant global impact. And the size and potential of the seabed resource means that once it gets going, once the economics start to stack up and the sizes become bigger of the ships and they're able to harvest more material and those problems are solved, it could have a huge global impact when it gathers that pace. And that's really it. Should we do it? I leave that open to you, the audience. The parallels are clear to see, and it's going to be very interesting over the next 12 months as to what happens with the International Seabed Authority and what happens to the trial, and whether we see commercial seabed mining in 2024. I look forward to questions.